Now, good evening.
Hi, that's Sarah.
How are you? So good evening, everyone. Likewise, it's great to see you, and thank you to everyone joining us this evening for this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of Dublin. As you see here, our guest this evening is Geraldine Walsh, the founder and CEO of the Dublin Civic Trust. Now, Geraldine, I'm really very much looking forward to this conversation, so thank you so much for being here.
That's true.
Well, I'm going to jump into the evening. If anyone has questions for Geraldine as we go through, please do type them in and we'll take some time to go through them. Now, Geraldine, before I talk too much about the Civic Trust, I'd love to know a little bit more about yourself and your own background that ultimately led to setting it up.
Well, it's a journey of people who are post-war children. I studied economics in UCC and came out in the 70s when we had joined the EU, and life was full of excitement because suddenly this whole new world of access to, well, in that time, 12 countries, which eventually grew to 28, as we know, was now, had freedom of movement, freedom of goods, freedom of people. And on top of that, a lot of organizations, like, you know, Europa and Nostra, which we'll talk about later on, but particularly the Council of Europe in 1947 had been founded with human rights as its particular aim, but also social justice. And always underlining most of these organizations was always cultural heritage, because I suppose Europe had come through a horrendous war, and not alone having lost huge numbers of its people and citizens in a horrible way, but it also had, its cities were pulverized, is the only word we could use. And yet Europe was always known as the cradle of civilization, depicting all that was great about craftsmanship and the extraordinary man's extraordinary ingenuity to turn stone and break into these incredible monuments of cathedrals and great houses and so on. And a lot of that was lost. So the Council of Europe came in Strasbourg, and then followed, as I said, Europa and Austria. And even within Ireland's point of view, we got a 1963 Planning Act, which was the first bit of formal planning. And from that came, as followed on, of course, was the European Union putting really environment at the heart of Europe. And in fact, the biggest body of legislation at that time was environmental legislation. So all the directives were being hopped into us in terms of groundwater directive, habitats, we know them all, water quality, plus a lot of funding as well to help us with cohesion funds and structural funds. And having studied economics, I was really interested in resource economics. But again, anything wasn't as available as it is today. So you had to sort of forage out things. And there was very little platforms in Ireland then for expressing your like or even your interest in trying to promote things. So I got involved with two NGOs, environmental NGOs in Europe. One was the European Environmental Bureau and the other was the European Partners for the Environment. And I have to say, these organizations are extraordinary because the body of people that were drawn to them was a whole cross-section from academia to maybe a few nutcases. First time I encountered the Green Party was even there. And I don't think they have changed. I mean, I have great admiration for their idealism, but sometimes practicality isn't there in abundance. But they're great at the same time. So that was my sort of introduction to being able to express. And within Ireland itself, really all we had from the cultural heritage or environmental point of view was Costigan and the Irish Georgian Society, both having left us a huge legacy. Particularly the Irish Georgian Society in terms of both Desmond and Marie Guinness, and I picked them out because they were the driving force in terms of buildings that wouldn't be with us today, like Castletown and Damer House and Roundwood and so on, known to everybody. But then Costigan kind of took what I would say the backlash of politics, because with the 63 Act, they got a designated authority, which was that they could view most planning applications, comment on them, and to some extent use a lobbying force or advocacy force to go against them. And of course, that was an anathema to politicians, and to would-be developers, builders who only saw the to some extent, the economic value of something, but had no idea of the intrinsic value or the total loss if we didn't go about our resources and how we minded them, how we built them, how we reintegrated them into society. And because Antarctica exercised that particular right they were given under 63 Act, because Bord Fóilte got it, so also did the Heritage Council, and so also did what eventually became the Department of Arts and Culture. And I think one other body, but they choose really more or less to let them lie dormant. And then Antarctica came out of, again, of idealism, people like Lloyd Prager, Frank Mitchell, Sean McBride. I mean, the great intellectual brains at that time. It gets an awful lot of bad press because it's kind of shoot the messenger. But it has left, I think, a very big legacy to this country, and it has helped young people to express themselves. It's a membership organization. So I, of course, cut my teeth there. I edited their magazine for a while, Living Heritage. I looked after properties, and I was introduced to one of the organizations in Europe through it. And then, I suppose the big breakthrough was really being accredited to the Rio process, the Art Conference. And there you really saw the beginning of what was the indicators that really the world was going through a nervous breakdown. And if we didn't do something about it and come together as a collective force, things were going to get worse. So, and then,
so from there, in terms of making what was, I can only imagine, a very big and bold decision at that time to go and set up the Dublin Civic Trust. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about, the decision, the founding mission, like what the early days were like?
Well, as I said, we had all these new indicators coming economically and socially, and from a humanitarian point of view. And yet when people made a stance against something, it was always known as being reactionary rather than being proactive. So a group of us who had a kind of a common mind in things decided that what you had to have was a sort of an inventory of your building stock. Because in those circumstances, once you knew what you had, you could then make your arguments as to why they should be retained. And I suppose things like the old DSB group of houses going, which has since gone again, the new building has taken over from the Stevenson and Gibney building, was a big breakthrough. There was a wonderful woman called Deirdre Kelly who oversaw an organization called A Living City. And they were always being pillared again by politics and by others saying you're interfering and so on. And the idea of the Civic Trust was to know your building stock like a good shopkeeper, and then you can put your wares out. If you shoe shop, you know how many pairs, a size 5 or 6 you have, and you're able to argue for them. So the trust was based on, registered as an educational trust, because it was to educate people as to the resource value, social value, the economic value, everything of buildings, because buildings are the identification of place. And Dublin is a particularly very nice European capital, which really manifests itself with its 18th and 19th century domestic building stock. Individually, a lot of it isn't great, but collectively it forms a very unique pattern. It's low scale, it's sort of embraces the topography. It sits between the mountains and the sea. It has two beautiful small rivers, the Towt and the Dodder, and also a lovely canal system. And really, we haven't yet got our heads around as a people as to how we integrate those into a sort of a compatible group of elements, and how buildings sit comfortably and have good manners with them. And I think that came across very much during the lockdown in the last year and a half, when we had a 5-kilometre limit and you decided where could you walk to, where could you cycle to, and you found there were so few places. And we've no pocket parks, we've very few trees in the city, etc., etc. So that was part of the background as well. But trying to retain buildings was the big thing. So we had 3 really pillars. One was to take on problematic buildings that could be would be demolished or were about to be demolished, and show that old buildings had new uses. The other was to do an inventory of all the pre-1920 buildings in the city. So you had this reference inventory that you could reference and make your argument for retention or otherwise. And then the third one was to leave a body of information through publications and through running seminars and so on, which would be aimed at individual people, but to a large degree, people in the professions who had to get familiar with what was a huge body of European legislation coming down, but also how they view their own. So in 92, we set up the Dublin Civic Trust, and in the usual way, you have to set up a company and then get charitable status for it. We had no money, no beginnings, and nobody was prepared to give us anything. And Dublin isn't a generous city when it comes to ideals like saving buildings. And I think there's something in the Celt that prefers to roam the countryside and live in bonds and things like that rather than buildings. Anyway, but a little bit of luck came our way, and New Ireland Assurance, who had a big complex of buildings from Dawson Street down to Nassau Street and up to South Frederick Street, had more or less built on everything except two houses. That was number 10 and number 11 South Frederick Street, and sort of going back to the 1730s. I think one was by the end of 1734. Two very interesting buildings in a terrible state. And they wanted to demolish them, which they got permission for, and put up maybe 8-10 apartments on the site of the two houses. And they did their cost benefit analysis and found it wouldn't work out, which is interesting to think now. It wasn't making economic sense. So we said to them, look, give it to us at no cost to you, no cost to us, and we'll fulfill your building requirement, which they had to have. They had to have a certain percentage. And in those circumstances, we both come out winners. And that was the beginning of being able to do a project, but also spend the minimum on the first house, get it sold, and with the capital from that, start what we call the revolving fund. And that's what we've been doing since we've been revolving. Now, we'd love to have 30, 40 houses under our belt instead of 9 or 10. But I think under the circumstances, even having 9 or 10 is quite an achievement, because we didn't get a huge amount of cooperation, which we thought we might have formed a relationship with Dublin City Council. Even though they're very good to us, they didn't see the merit. But I think Ireland is always a bit late in coming to the table. And I think, I hope I'm right, I think the next decade or two may see the city differently, even though we're going through difficult times with heights and so on at the moment, but that'll hopefully iron itself out. And so from there, we went from Frederick Street down to Angel Street, and Angel Street with Porrick Pierce's house in Pierce Street. And we, where then to, Castle Street, then Ormond Quay. But in between, we did do two houses with the City Council, number 9 Merchants Quay, which is a beautiful one, which again had a demolition order on it, and 2 Andrew Street. So that's more or less the collection of buildings. And today we're celebrating having been recognized by Europe with a very prestigious award for a single domestic dwelling in an urban setting, which is the category that the Europa and Nostra awards fell into. And so the building sits on the quays, very ordinary, nothing extraordinary. But really what it is, Sarah, is that it's part of that great sort of, what would you call them, higgledy-piggledy collection that really, start at the forecourts or below the forecourts and sort of move all the way up to O'Connell Bridge. And because they're on the north side of the quays, when the sun is shining from the south side, it's just something you don't sort of find in other cities. It's quite unique to Dublin. You get the lovely brickwork, you get the different parapet heights, you get the different roof elements and so on. And it's sort of, I suppose, one of our main ambitions that as many of those can be reinstated as possible and retained maybe for another 100 years.
And it's one thing I did when reading up about the Civic Trust in advance of this conversation. One piece of advice that you give to owners or people who occupy kind of special buildings is really to get to research and to know your building. And I I was looking up the Europa Nostra win, and I know I noted that the way the judges spoke about it, they said that the project was undertaken to specifically be a model for others, showcasing that the heritage of buildings common to Dublin has value and contributes to a more sustainable development of the city, which is such a wonderful endorsement of the work. But taking, say, number 18, like, tell me a little bit about the history of that building. What do we know about it?
Yeah, well, because we're a revolving fund, whatever we're occupying at the time has to be sold on to release the capital from it to buy the next, because that's the system. Now, in 2015, 2016, it was just coming out of the recession, and buildings were quite reasonable. But we're never in a position to borrow because we're just a charitable group, and you're not going to put the onus on board members, to put any of their own homes deeds in the bank in order to fund another house. So therefore, we've got to release that capital. And I have to tell you, Sarah, my colleague who worked closely with Graham Hickey and we must have went to about 20 different houses between Parnell Square, Mountjoy Square, right into the south side of the city to find a suitable building, because it's not everyone we do. I mean, putting the effort in, it has to leave a legacy. Very, very difficult to purchase. Most had been pre-bought, or some of them were in site assembly. You would find Dublin ownership a very, very peculiar situation. So we came across this one, which was well known to anybody who used the north side of the quays, because Watts were gun makers and fishing and fly makers, the last of their trade in Dublin. And they had this quite peculiar green painted shop and a very interesting sign, hanging sign. So it was locked up when I kind of got to know it. I didn't know it under its old usage. And then the Ulster Bank pondered in NAM and Bank, what would you say, disposed of the property. We're selling it because those that had bought it weren't able to continue with their programme, even though they'd got permission for 10 apartments, keep the facade of one building, level the rest and build. So again, that was an enticement to us, because here we could keep the entire building. So luckily, two things came together. We were able to sell for Castle Street, which was another very interesting building, which we'd saved because it was one of the last White Street Commission buildings left on Castle Street, which in its day was probably one of the most important streets in Dublin, because Lord Edward Street didn't exist until the previous century. So all the traffic came up Corkhill, up Castle Street, down by Wearbrooks Church, was within the walls of Dublin. And practically everything that was part of Castle Street was gone except Barnwell's shoemakers. So we had saved that in 10 years previous to this, which was great. So we got a good price, about 900,000, and which was really what it cost us and what we put into it, but it's great to get it back out. And so we were able to buy Ormond Quay, and Ormond Quay consisted of the front part, which was an 1840s building, and then at the back of it, in Arran Street, attached to the shop, as it were, as we call it, the shop, was a thing called a warehouse, which is 100 years older, very interesting building. 3 rooms kind of stacked one on top of another. And then there's a site beside that, which had a very nice house on it, because I saw photographs, but that's since demolished. So we started with the 1840s. Now the 1840s house is the 4th building to stand on that site, because all that site was developed by the Duke of Ormond in the 1680s, when he came back after the Civil War was over and they returned to Dublin. He became Viceroy. His big undertaking, as we all know, was the Royal Hospital, but he also did an embankment on the quays where we are, and hence Ormond Quay. We had the Ormond markets behind it, and it was the former properties of the Monastery of St. Mary's, which is the undercroft of it is still down in Mary's Lane. So the basement and the footprint is still the same as the 1680s. It was a kind of a French type of house in terms of style. It had a very deep roof with dormer windows in it. And most of the leases, the great thing is we have all the leases. There's family of Dawsons in the north. They were settled in the north of Ireland who owned the leasehold. So all their papers were available in the Registry of Deeds. And then they had a 70-year lease, or given a 70-year lease on it, and it had to be replaced. So the next house had a gable, because the gables were in fashion in the early part of the 18th century. Then the gable went when it went out of fashion and became a flat parapet. So that was the third one. And then in 1843, they leveled it down to the first floor and built what is ours. So it's an 1843 building with a fashionable White Street Commissioners type of shop front with the arched windows and very nice granite. But the whole thing was covered in pebble dash when we got it. It had quite a deflection to the side. And everything was painted green, including all the granite, and all the elements were more or less missing or covered in paint. The dangerous buildings in Dublin City Council wanted to put a notice on it. So we had to get a good engineer who would come up with a good plan. So there's a lot of steel inserted in bringing it back, particularly the side elevation. And that was done. And very good firm of Nolans builders came on board to do it. Now, it took 1.5 years before they arrived, because when you get these buildings, just as you said a few moments ago, the most important thing for anybody is to study it, all but to sleep in it for a week or a month and look at all the cracks, difficulties, heights of ceilings, floorboards. Most of the interior was missing, because in 1847, when it was, or 43, I should say, when it was rebuilt, it was taken by a firm of Graham and Berry, and they were tea and wine merchants. And the upstairs, according to the deed, was let to solicitors. And they stayed there until 1912. And in 1912, it was taken over by the Douglas Hotel. Okay. And hence the connecting points upstairs and at floor level to the back building, because obviously they needed quite a bit of room if they were operating a hotel. And then Watts came along with their fishing rods and fly making and gun making, and they seemed to remove the staircase. Now, when you remove the full staircase, you destabilize the building. So that was part of the deflection. There was a fire on the second floor. There was all kinds of things. It was what you'd call brutalized, but it still stood there. Okay. So we had to do a lot of kind of, what do you say, archaeological work. And we actually have original walls going back to the 1680s, and try and put a pattern or put manners on it. There's quite a deep basement in it as well. And so that took 2 years, as well as doing all that structural work and reinstating staircases. And we tried to keep as much original material as possible. And then we went in search of all the craftsmen who would have worked on it. And because it was 1843, it was very fashionable in Dublin at that time to use wallpaper. And there was about 46 paper stainers on Ormond Quay and Capel Street. Paper makers were called paper stainers. And being under the English at the time, all the patents for the paper were sent to Kew, where they hold all these patents. And the Boswells, James Boswell, who worked a few doors up from what is now our building, had made beautiful wallpaper 1843, which is yellow. You mightn't choose it if it didn't have the connection with James Boswell. So we, David Skinner, as you know, who works in Dublin and is the historic paper maker and is a great person, went to Kew and found all of these, and we came back and we chose 4 to 5 different wallpapers, and he reblocked them. So there in the rooms upstairs, we got lamps remade, again wanting to get Irish craftsmen. So I had very good iron man, Paul Devlin, who made the brackets, and then he spun the copper caps for them, and then Leadbetters did the glass bowls, I think that's the correct word, which have gone back, which we had found, and I think it was in the map, a Lawrence map that they hung on the wall. And the biggest really achievement in that house was taking off the tons, is the only word you could use, of pebble dash. Oh my God, how the building stood, how they held it up, I don't know. And we didn't know what we were going to find because we didn't know what condition the brick was going to be in. Because if there had been a very strong bond between the pebble dash and the brick, then the face of the brick was gone and that you'd have to re-render the building. But luckily the building had been painted. And so there was paint when the pebble dash went on, and the paint acted as a kind of a barrier between a very strong adhesive. So it's funny what you find. And the brick pointers were excellent that Nolan's had. So we found a tiny little bit of original brick wigging, which is the Irish tuck pointing, where they use a coloured mortar to try and get a consistency throughout the facade behind the sign. And we used that as an example, which was great. So again, these are the tiny things you find when you do things. And all this work, Sarah, what's great for Dublin is it starts to train young people who come in as apprentices. And they did the most, I think, one of the best wigging jobs in Dublin. Everybody talks about it. And I think maybe that might have swung some of the jury of Europa and Nostra as well when they saw the transformation.
But then
what it was. And Lamb's Tongue then did all the joinery. Because we again had to do huge research to find out, because in fact they had moved the door to the side. We put it back to the middle. Then we had found 3 windows, in fact, that were totally blocked up. We didn't know they existed. And then we had to get the pattern at the windows and all of that sort of thing. But anyway, that's all part of the work, and that's part of what's so wonderful about Dublin. And that's only one house of hundreds that exist.
And actually, that leads me very nicely, because it is the love and care with which you describe the work that yourself and your team are doing. It's really it's inspiring to listen to. I do see my own colleague Trevor, who's obviously here with us this evening.
Okay, yeah.
He put in a comment just saying, Geraldine, you deserve the freedom of Dublin for your magnificent determination to preserve our great city.
Oh, thanks, Trevor. I can return the compliment to him.
So Trevor's question to you is, apart from those which you've worked on, what is your favourite building in Dublin?
What's my
favourite building in Dublin?
It's very hard because there's a lot of lovely, what I called domestic traditional buildings like that. I mean, even if you move up the quays, the one that's just been completed, number 1, that again, the same architect, James Kelly, who's on our board as well, who did ours and did number 1 recently, is just a lovely building, purely because even when you're in it, you think you're sitting on the Liffey. And if you move further up, there's 2 or 3. Some of them, I have to say, in sort of poor state at the moment, but beautiful panelled houses. But I mean, so you could pick within the city itself a number of domestic panelled houses that I'd live in any of them. And then if you go, to the institutional buildings, I mean, I don't think Dublin has great institutional buildings, to be quite honest. We have the 2 Gandon buildings, and then we have kind of the end of the 18th century. Now we have Francis Johnson at the beginning, whenever GPO 1812 or 1820, give or take. And really, that's it. And so I suppose, sorry, I didn't answer Trevor's question. I suppose my real favourite building is Newcombe Bank, really, which is the rates office. I just love it. And I'm kind of a little bit sad at the moment because it's all blocked up. And I know council are going to do a job on it, but sometimes they take too long and, things kind of fester. So hopefully it'll but it's the fact that it was doubled up, because Newcome's Bank was doubled up and you'd hardly see it. It's so seamless, the fact that it was duplicated, and it goes to show what craftsmanship can do. When it's well executed. So I suppose the rates office is one, and particularly the inside, has beautiful oval room and has a lovely kind of a winding staircase going up to it. So hopefully it'll find a good what would you say, another 100 years of use.
And just when you mentioned kind of residential buildings there a moment ago, like when we look at the different styles of residential architecture, what's my question? Do you think in how we protect and preserve and conserve these buildings, is it as important to protect every style of architecture from, you know, a Dublin Corporation house through to a Georgian townhouse, because they're each a layer of the architectural fabric of Dublin? Or is there a hierarchy in how we should be spending?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sarah. I mean, people talk about that. I suppose if you confine the city to really between the 4 squares, or 5 squares, if you take Stephen's Green, and that small kind of area, which leaves you with the Gardner Estate in the north and the Fitzwilliam Estate on the south, which is from the late 1700s into, or 1600s into the early 1700s. There's a typology that comes through that. And it's the keeping that intact and keeping it in a mass, as it were. So you kind of see it in its totality. Outside of that, you know, we have a few, because we've just about 2 years ago did an inventory of what were the remains of the gables houses, because Dublin was a gable city up to about 1720. You'd see it in Tudor's lovely drawing of College Green. And you might say, are they the top of the pile, those that remain? There's a few down in Temple Bar, and there's some in Molesworth Street, and so on, of the early gabled houses. You identify them from the fenestration on the outside. If you keep on that, I think it's very important that everything that can be kept is kept in order to create a critical mass and to create that identity. It's like Paris and Haussmann, it's like Bath and John Woods. You know, you don't take them out, you keep them because they form that nucleus, or Edinburgh and the new city. And this is something that we can't get across to the local authority, that you don't start to dilute to the point of it's hardly visible, or you don't start putting tall buildings into the middle of them because they don't speak to each other. There's no, the whole context is gone. So it's this, I suppose, is what's happening in Dublin, and what's sad at the moment, that in the 90s, we probably had the most protective legislation we've ever had. And it came as a result of the few things I was talking about, like the Rio process of Mrs. Brookland and her famous coining of the word sustainability, which was, you know, environmental protection and social justice and equality and so on. And it has all now become part of everyday, which is great vocabulary. And in the 90s, Ireland, for some unknown reason, kind of woke up when we got the Heritage Council became a statutory body, and Michael D came to power, and he gave us the first our ministry fully looking at arts, culture and the Gaeltacht, which has really left a great legacy. And things like the Landmark Trust was founded, and the Dublin Civic Trust was founded, and then particularly the Granada Convention, which was the combination of the Venice Charter and the Borough Charter, which were all signed up to over the years of looking at different elements of European cultural architecture. And it was a statutory instrument, and out of that came the 2000 Planning and Development Act, which is really the backbone of how Dublin has really any legibility left. And as we know, we have 9,000 protected structures. Some say too many. That's as a result of how the list was put together. People made contributions on Tashkent, made big contributions to the Georgians, residence groups and so on. So they all got piled in and they all got listed under one heading, protected structures. And then very wisely, the department did the National Infantry right throughout Ireland, and they kept producing other lists and gave them to the council, and it was up to the council to adopt them. Now, at the moment, there's a piece of legislation in the pipeline which wants to, reduce and diminish the status of protective structures. And I think Dublin has been taking such a whacking with high rise and with the reduction of the quality of dwellings, or at least of apartments, where dual aspect was removed and size was reduced. And then we have this co-living, and we have such a jumble mixture of I mean, nobody knows what it's going to turn out to be. To have this added to it, that we just look at very special lists of list 1 and list 2, which was the British, or is the British system. I think the other works. I think you can have ACAs, which are objective conservation areas, which looks at the character of place and the streets and retains exteriors. But I think it's something we should all have a very big think about and really act against it if we felt it was against the interest of the city.
And kind of on that point of kind of the experience of the city, you know, if we look at, as you mentioned earlier, you know, Dublin is a city which has really quite spectacular natural and built heritage, and we are quite exceptional as a city goes. And I kind of wonder, how are we perceived on an international stage, or how do we factor in as a European capital?
I think that's a very brave question. Because I think we would rate very low, and we do rate low. I mean, you've only got to see the odd time it's a swipe, is the one for better word, taken at us by, oh gosh, what you call the two famous books we all buy going away? The Lonely Planet, and I've forgotten the other one. Yeah. And they have made quite, how would you say, uncomplimentary sentences, I think, justified. I think we have this notion that if we have this thing of loads of pubs shouting their heads off, and this thing of crack that we all talk about, and you know, we can excuse dirty space and we can excuse bad behaviour. And I'm not saying that shouldn't. Everybody should be able to enjoy themselves. Of course they can, but sometimes it's done at the expense of what is public order, or what is enjoyability of space or shared space. I think there's a terrible act from Dublin City Council of having a public domain plan. There's been no tree planting that I can remember. There's no little pocket parks. There's little or no features. I mean, even we saw in the last few weeks the closing down or removal of any facilities like public loos and so on created havoc, and it saw nothing wrong with it. So we need to have a master plan for Dublin, and the master plan has to take a 20-year view. And cities who have really proven that they work and they live for their people, and in doing that, people then live for them. So you get that great interplay between place and person, which has gone out of Dublin at the moment, totally gone, particularly gone out of the city. It has to come back, and that really only can come through master plan, because everything, it's not that it's preordained, but it's seen to work holistically. And what happens in Dublin? Everything is piecemeal. Oh, you can put 22 stories there, or you can put co-living there, and then you can put student accommodation. And then you look at the consequence, and everything is a transient population of 3 months or 4 months who really don't partake in the economy because they're just coming and going, who never form a community, and visually then the high rises all out of sync. And you get this sort of a thing. And it seems to be excused on the grounds that it creates jobs and it's making money for somebody. And I just love a real debate of you know, how you bring in the three elements of society: culture and environment and economy. And they should all be able to sit very comfortably together to the benefit of each other. But really at the top of the pile should be society and forming communities. And
like Dublin is, you know, we are a designated UNESCO Cultural Heritage City. You know,
I think we're a literary city.
Literary, sorry, I apologize. Yes.
No,
you've caught me, absolutely. Yeah. But if we're looking at this concept of master planning and kind of vision for the future of Dublin, is Dublin, the brand of Dublin, perhaps a cultural city? Or what do you think that master plan, what would it look like to you?
I don't know. I think it depends on what age group you fall into. I mean, we all saw cities differently if we were 19 or 29 or 39 or 59 or 69. I mean, they mean different things. But for that matter, there should be an overlap. That there's always a comfort factor. That there's always a factor of enjoyability. That there's safety. That what Dublin has, which is friendliness and good, great food, fabulous restaurants now, lovely buildings to look at. Very, very nice city parks, but they need connectivity into, you know, street seating and street so on. Greater access to the river. All those things have to happen. And I think every age group will take their own, you know, enjoyability from it. We seem to allow dominant groups to lobby and dominate, and whoever shouts the loudest, wins the prize kind of thing. And I think maybe this comes back to the fact that we need an elected Lord Mayor, that somebody that goes up with a proper set of objectives, and they're elected like the Lord Mayor of Barcelona or Paris or whatever other city that we all know works on that basis, or Vienna, and they get their 3 or 5 year term of office and they work to that. Same in New York. We've seen how a mayor in New York can transform a city. And for some unknown reason, why we allow elected power to keep telling us we can't have it. I mean, they're only elected at the behest of people. And yet they tell people, oh, no, you can't. And so we need a strong voice. We need a platform. We need champions for the city. I think all of these things have to come. Maybe they'll come out of this pandemic. Maybe people have sat back and looked. But I'm afraid that, with the footfall having fallen so much, and it's not going to come back. If it comes back in different ways. I mean, the very rich tourists will take a while to come back. The wealthy businessman isn't going to travel to the same extent. If the city isn't attractive, they're definitely not going to put it on their list. And if the city is known to have an antisocial slant to it, and if it has dirty buildings and so on, so we really have to start getting our act together. And maybe we could take a leaf out of cities like Madrid, which were very down at heel maybe 30 years ago, and they sort of took 2 or 3 teams. Like Madrid took things like the best of cuisine and very small, attractive boutique type of shopping experience. Could be anything from selling candles to selling sandals, but beautifully presented. And in that sense, it had an attraction. And then, of course, backed up by its wonderful museums. But it had to find something, because, I mean, it's sitting on the middle of a meseta, too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. So it's a very difficult one to sell. And yet it can do it. And yet we have all these extraordinary attractions, and we don't seem to. No, that's my take. Maybe other people see it differently.
I see someone has just written in to say that, Geraldine, they find your passion inspiring, and I think they may walk through the city watching it through your eyes from now on.
They might like what they see through my eyes.
And so I do think, as you mentioned a moment ago, it'll be very interesting to see the impact of the pandemic on the next chapter of the story of Dublin. And I think also it must be said that hybrid working, where people are at a mixture, will inevitably impact how we interact with the city centre. Like, if we're working towards a more livable Dublin, how do we turn this into an opportunity?
I suppose, getting where my economic hat, with economics, it's about turning a resource into a working element. It's about, and that's really what Europa, Nostra, when the president of the commission, and not president of the commission, president of the parliament rather, and the commissioner for culture and innovation, who gave the listings of people who had won, talked about a new renaissance. She felt, she's Bulgarian, very nice lady, said maybe we could get a new beginning, because a lot of other European cities are in the same thing. I think Dublin personally could go for 2 aims. One is go for real culture, really make the designation of literary UNESCO status, which we don't at all. I mean, where I lived, not far from me, was the Shaw's Museum, the most wonderful, and it was done on a voluntary basis. Des McGuinness again led it with a lot of people I knew who, and I even did a small bit of work, but I couldn't say I was part of it. I was only on the outside of it. And it was exquisitely put back as a Victorian house. I mean, it was like something you'd see in London and Cheney Walk going down to Carlyle's house or something. And then the group kind of didn't fall asunder, but some of them passed away, and they gave it to Fáilte Ireland, I think, and who gave it to Dublin City Council. And it has been sitting locked up for 5 years now, and even the net curtains are rotting and falling asunder. And all they can think of is, we'll turn it into 2 flats for writers. This was the most perfect house. I mean, here Shaw lived for, 14 years. Didn't like Dublin, didn't like his home. But that doesn't matter. But it was so beautifully put back. We were involved ages ago doing Pierce's home down at 27 Pierce, another house, put it back exactly as the Pierces lived in, because it had all been turned into carpet shops and butchers and all kinds of things. And we spent a lot of time copying the one next door, which was luckily Hopkins and Hopkins were next door, and they had all the rooms and profiles of joinery and everything were there. And it's sitting there. And yet, you know, 2 signatories to the proclamation, you know, 2 extraordinary men in their own right, one a great writer, one a lovely sculptor. Their father, a well-known pamphleteer as well. Besides being a monumental sculptor, he wrote great pamphlets on home rule and everything. And yet here we are, literary capital, nothing too wild. All you have is a statue in the corner of the green. Shaw, this, or at least what's in Yeats' name. I'm only taking these, not to mind the contemporary writers. And yet we have this great prize. We give one of the biggest prizes for writing in the year. City Council have it just coming on stream, or maybe they've just had it. You know, great writers coming over this week in Doki. They have, and yet, I don't know, there's something wrong. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, which means there's about 10 pieces missing, so you can never get the real pattern when you're trying to see what is it meant to be. There's all these pieces. Do you get it?
I do, but at least if it's a jigsaw, it means it is eventually possible to solve it. I see a question coming in here that I'm really curious to know your answer to. Jane is asking, do you think there's a modern building in the city today that really is worth saving and that you hope will be around 100 plus years from now?
Any building from the 1920s, post World War I, there's an awful lot of them very beautiful, even down along the canals. Even the one that went in the last year, the Goulding buildings, I loved it. It was like a bit of brutalist sculpture, but it was lovely. And it sat comfortably and it kind of pulled your eye in. So, I mean, the big difference between, you know, post-1920 and pre-1920 is, one, are engineered buildings because they're built of steel, glass and concrete. And they're usually, a lot of it built off-site and the modules are put together and so on. And they're built very functional buildings, and they have, when they're built, it's sort of written into them, they have 25 to 35 years life. So they don't see them as continuums and like the built of stone or brick or crafted and, you know, beautifully ornate inside and so on. So in a way, they're not comparative, and yet both of them have you know, function and so on. So I think we have a lot of very nice, even a lot of down both the North Quays and South Quays have turned out to be very nice. Even the convention centre with its big statement of its whatever it's supposed to be shouting at you, you know, it makes a statement of the 21st century. So to Jane, yes, you know, I'm not. I think there's some great beauty in modern. I mean, we all know, you know, Geary's work, which is this smashed up, squashed up, great. Like if you got in a temper with a big bowl of jelly and turned it into all kinds of shapes, but he seems to be able to, and you can go to look at the Guggenheim and, you know, in Bilbao and so on. So, you know, life is full of these wonderments of what can be done. And I wouldn't say that Dublin has stagnation be only one. It's how you marry them and how you complement them. And I think we haven't got there's nobody able to articulate. And I kind of, in a way, have a kind of a sorrow that the schools of architecture, and we have 2 of them in the city and we have 4 more outside the city, or 5 more if you take Belfast. These are academics, these are teachers of the art and subject matter. These are people who are framing the young minds. And yet I don't see or hear any great statement or even comment. And the same from the institutes, whether the Institute of Planners, Institute of Architects, Institute of Surveyors, and so on and so forth. I feel we should, that particular third level body could have quite a legitimacy, even to just stimulate good conversation. And I think our media lets us down totally. I mean, I think the media has let us down so badly now that nobody wants to turn it on. I think because it's you need a Xanax after it, because it's kind of, you know, we should be discussing what we're discussing here.
And I guess that's the reality of the past kind of year and a half that we've all been living through. There is such a hunger now to re-engage and to actually have these meaningful conversations. And I guess the hope is that it continues and that those conversations become more amplified and they happen on a larger platform. But I think kind of just to ask you from our own individual perspectives, something that the Dublin Civic Trust lectures and talks about and kind of supports people in is this idea of conserving and protecting our own homes and Dublin's architecture. I wonder if you might kind of tell us a little bit about a couple of the kind of key guiding principles of conservation.
I suppose the main guiding principle of conservation is to recognise what it is. First of all, the materials it's composed of, because there's 5 to 6 materials. It's not rocket science. You're either brick, stone, timber, iron, if it's rainwater goods, and slate, most of Irish houses are covered in slate. And if you know the functionality of those 5 materials and how they knit together, and usually they're knitted together with lime, because lime is a porous material, which is very flexible and very easily worked and very accessible and quite extraordinary. And since the Romans found it, most of the great buildings of the world have lime. So once you know that functionality, once you know how they work, you can mend anything. This thing all costs thousands. It doesn't. Crazy. You can replace good windows with, most windows that are pre-war, again, have heartwood, which is when the rings are very tight. So it's really like concrete. And once you scrape off the paint, you might have to splice a little bit in, but you can keep all your windows. Whereas everything post-war is full of, the rings are so far apart, all the sap pulls in the moisture and hence the rot comes. So that's part of not maturing enough. And once you know that, you can look at everything. So I think buildings to me can go on and on and on. If I look at the Pantheon, my famous building, if you ask me what's my famous building in the world, it's the Pantheon in Rome. I never fail to be mesmerized by it. And when you think of what it's gone through and what it has stood for and how it's standing there and it didn't come through wars and everything. The same with our buildings. They can last and last and last. So they have embedded energy in them. They have primary material. And the big outcry at the moment, as we know from all over the world, is the circular economy, how we use and use and use and use instead of going and getting scarce resources, how we keep carbon embedded, how we don't use it in making new concrete or new glass or new whatever. And resource efficiency, how do we get more from less? So all the young people coming up, and I'm sure anybody listening who has kids at school, they all coming home and say, don't do that, don't do that and that. So it's a new vocabulary and it's a new way of thinking, but it's a must. And also the throwaway culture, which we lived in, Sarah. The buildings since post-war or post-World War I, are the ones that will be taken down and disposed of. And you've only got to see them purely because they're engineered and they're built of different materials. So I've really forgotten. What was the question again? I've forgotten.
No, I think you.
I went off into a little bit of a rant there.
No, it was fascinating. And I guess we're kind of rounding out the hour. And so the question that's kind of listening to you speak and listening to this conversation, the thing that has stuck in my mind is if you look at the problem that you set out to address back in 1992, I think you said it was.
Yeah, that's right.
How do you believe we as a city are doing today? And what are you hopeful for in the future?
I think those that make decisions, and they're all very nice people, and they're all well-meaning, but there seems to be a disjointness in the collective thinking and in the totality of planning. And there seems to be too many silos when it comes to where who has authority, who hasn't got authority. And in the end, everything falls into the cracks. And I think what we set out to do was to educate. So we're a registered educational trust, and was to say, you can do it this way. This is what it'll cost. This will give it longevity. This will retain it, et cetera, and give the reason why. And it's up to you to accept or not to accept. And when you asked the question earlier on what is conservation, well, conservation is replacing like with like where possible and minimum intervention. So you don't, but if you don't have to intervene, don't. You know, if in other words, if it don't you don't have to mend if it's not broken. And that's the kind of basic, the basic principles of conserving. And if they underwrite the principles, and I think a great example in Dublin is the two Victorian, well, late Georgian Victorian suburbs that arose, which was Pembroke and of course Rathmines, Rathgar. And when you go through either of them, whether it's Ballsbridge now, whether it's, you know, all that extent, and see the extraordinary houses, that most of them there from about the 1830s or 1840s on, which are still possibly the most desirable in terms of living, because they give great space and very nice sized plots. They're also close to the city. They also have all the facilities around them, and they have all the comforts of living. And I know you that will never happen because that kind of space won't be given again. But I think this thing of trying to build, you know, 26 stories, 28 stories, crazy after knocking down Ballyone flats and they're back again in this format. And instead of building like what they do in Germany and Austria, like they build blocks, maybe of 8 apartments within a block, and then they give the 4 sides entry points. So people, it's like you have your own hall door, no matter how many within it. And these work. You know, it's maximizing sight, but it's also giving that sense of dignity and belonging, which people want and need. And yet there's a community in it. But instead of that, we seem to rush off and take the American model, because I keep saying the Irish are a bit like the Indians in Manhattan. They took the necklace from the Dutch and gave them Manhattan Island. And we've kind of done the same in the last kind of, I suppose, since the recession. We're kind of very happy to hand over and put no conditionality in. And I don't know what the eventual outcome of everything is going to be, because the dictate for how much is returned on the site seems to not come from within the nation. It seems to come from an exterior. Well, that's my view. So I'll take all the blame if somebody says, what's that lassie talking about? That's my observation. And I think we have to get more protective of what is resource Dublin, what is resource Ireland, in the nicest possible way. We can create all the jobs, we can maximise its economic value and have it socially and community inclusive.
I think this idea of ultimately building community is key. And I think that's what we all ultimately are.
And just as a final one to that, what epitomizes for me at the moment is that Dublin had 3 markets, the Ivy Market and 2, fish market and fruit market. It has none today. And yet we have probably some of the best artisan food and some of the best, you know, manufactured food as well as artisan, as well as the fact everybody knows the traceability of it. And we should be showcasing this food because we don't even have to showcase it. It's a given that it's grown on the windy slopes of the mountains of Ireland. And yet there's no place to buy it, to showcase it. And all they're saying is, oh, we find a use for the fruit market. And then somebody sits on the other one for 14 years. And it's this kind of thing, Sarah, that I find it unacceptable.
Well, I think on behalf of the architecture of Dublin, I am delighted we have advocates such as yourself. Geraldine, it is so genuinely heartening to hear about the work of the Dublin Civic Trust. It really is inspiring, genuinely.
Oh, well, I mean, you can return the compliment to the Little Museum of Dublin. It's the very same. So in fact, collectively, I think there's an awful lot of people that think like both of us and have the same desire for the ultimate, to have a better place to live for everybody. That's really the ultimate, and the enjoyability factor, the big thing. So we get there, Sarah.
We will get there, and
we'll get there with Trevor. Trevor is a great has a great person for arriving at the goal he wants.
Oh, absolutely, and caring about. I think that's the thing, caring about the future of our city.
Yeah.
But no, I think on that note, I think I'm going to conclude on a hopeful and forward-looking note and just say, Geraldine, that was such a sincerely wonderful way to spend an hour.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for asking me. Well, listen, you're free now to edit anything out you like. I don't mind.
Not at all. That was a delight. It really was. To everyone who's been with us and asking questions, thank you so much for taking the time. So this is it for another week of 120 Dublin Stories.
You're terrific. How far down are you? How far into 120 are you?
Oh, wow. This week is mid-50s. We're probably about 55, 56 weeks into it.
Great, terrific. So you're halfway, more than halfway. That's brilliant.
There we go, yeah. Not the 6 weeks we initially thought the pandemic would be, but nearly there.
That's great. Well, I hope it's useful. That's the main thing.
No, this was a delight. Thank you so much, genuinely.
Okay, Sarah. Thank you.
Good evening, and we'll see you all next week for another 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. So good evening, good night.
Good evening. Thank you, Sarah.